Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody can hear me. So if I could have just a little hand check to see who can hear me. Seem to have some attendees today. Yes, hello. Great. Okay. Well, welcome to your third session now on this program, and the first of the methodology sessions. Just a bit of housekeeping to start. You had Heather last week, and I know she uploaded all of her stuff, a fortnight ago actually, and she uploaded all of her things to the Moodle site. I've added the YouTube session from the first. It's been converted into a YouTube clip, and hopefully you can all get access to that. Yes, I have started talking. Hopefully you can all hear me. I'm just going to do a little bit of an audio check. Can everybody hear me? Not. Okay, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, I think I've got everybody now can hear me. Great, right. So as I was saying, housekeeping. So the session from the first week is up on YouTube now, and if you click the link it should work. If not, email me and I will try and I will basically send you the link to the email. A fortnight ago you had Heather, and hopefully that session went well, and all of her material is up on Moodle. Today's session is up on Moodle, and the recording will go up either as an audio recording if it's not too big, or it will go up as a YouTube clip, as I now know how to do that. A fortnight's time we are going to do quantitative research methodology. That is going to be a narrated PowerPoint which will be uploaded sometime next week, and then a fortnight after that, which is actually the 17th of November, is another narrated PowerPoint, this time by Ruth Endicott. I'm not sure when she's going to upload that, but hopefully that will be well in advance. What I propose to do on Monday the 17th of November is offer a tutorial either via email, via webinar, or via phone calls, or via email, whatever you would like. So I will be available for tutorial support on the 17th of November. The first half of today, well, the first bit of today is going to be the methodology section, and then we're going to take a break, and then we're going to talk about the assignment tutorial, or I've got a brief Word document that I've uploaded that I'd like to go through with you, I'm just going to address some sound problems before I start. I still don't think everybody can hear me. I've got everything checked this end, Rebecca, so I'll type you a message. Can everybody else hear me? Yes from Julie, yes from Victoria, yes from Josie, thank you. Rebecca, great, thank you. I'm just waiting, Rebecca Laws, You still can't hear me? Okay, I'm gonna start, and hopefully the other Rebecca will be able to address her speaker issues. Right. Okay. Okay, so we're going to talk about qualitative research methodology today. I'm just going to have a brief revision, well not revision, review of what we discussed a couple of weeks ago, which was the whole idea of paradigms and so on. So with qualitative research methodology, you're specifically talking about a paradigm which here Smith describes as a scientific and structured problem. So the quote here from Smith is, different scientific communities who share specific constellation of belief, views and techniques for dealing with questions that are interesting. How one should break down an interesting question into solvable parts and how to interpret the relationship between those parts to answer. So we're talking about a particular paradigm, we're talking about a particular shared set of beliefs and values. Because sometimes what gets a bit confusing is whether we're talking about method or methodology, and I'm talking about methodology here, purely about methodology. So when we're talking about a qualitative methodology, which is what we're going to talk about this afternoon, we're going to talk about a paradigm or perspective that's adopted from an interpretive or humanistic value or view. So I hope that having done a little bit of reading and done a little bit of thinking about your research paradigms, you're now looking at different pieces that you're reading and thinking to yourself, the method might be this, the method might be a survey, the method might be a trial, whatever, but the viewpoint, the paradigm from which this research question stems is either qualitative or quantitative. And so that it's clear from what you're reading where the researcher was sitting, where they were looking at the world from. And it's really important that when you develop your own research questions that that's very clear in your head, what sort of perspective you're coming from and where you are viewing the world. So when we talk about quantitative versus qualitative research, we talk about either words or numbers, reason or cause, understanding, explanation, and we come at it from a subjective perspective or an objective perspective. And this really determines how you are going to collect your data, so your method of data collection. And it's really fundamental to the way that you then go on to research and address a research question. So the contrasting values are that from the qualitative perspective, we look at the research question from a holistic perspective. So our methods are flexible and our purpose is to describe or theorize. So we are not going to necessarily go into a research exercise, a research question, with the method of data collection completely set in stone, because as the purpose of the research is to explore and theorize and describe, it may be needed to follow a different method of data collection to answer the questions that you wish to address. And so some might say that if it's not predetermined, then it's not valid and not reliable and not rigid and therefore doesn't answer the research question. But it's important to remember that in qualitative research it is never the aim to test or prove something. It is simply the aim to describe or theorize. So whereas with quantitative research, we come from a reductionistic and deterministic perspective. And our methods in quantitative research are always predetermined because it's a testing exercise, a measurement exercise. So in quantitative research, often your sample size, your method of data collection are not only predetermined but pretty rigid in their plan. So in qualitative research, the questions asked often come from a specific perspective. And the sort of questions that we might be asked is what is going on in a particular setting, social setting. So what is actually happening? And when we look further at particular research perspectives, we might pick a research perspective that's very much focused on what is going on in a particular social setting. What are the relevant variables to the study? So we're still investigating what the influences might be, but whereas in a quantitative research we might try and exclude as many variables as possible, sometimes in qualitative research the questions will be much more holistic. Which people take part, so this is very much determining who our sample is going to be and how our sample is going to be constructed. What are the meanings of their activities? And this very much goes to asking questions about why do people do what they do? Why do people behave in certain particular ways? Why do people react in certain ways? So this is far more interpretive, investigative, and you are not testing anything. Which concepts and categories are used? And what do people really think and really feel? So the kind of questions that we're asking are very different questions to those that we would ask in qualitative and quantitative research. So pause for a minute and think to yourself, the research that you're thinking of doing next year as part of your dissertation, does that fit into any of those particular questions? And do you therefore think that your paradigm of research will be qualitative or quantitative? So have a think for a minute and see if you can. Do you think you're going to be coming at it from a qualitative perspective, i.e. a qualitative paradigm, or a quantitative? We'll wait for some responses. I've got two qualitatives so far. So the two of you that have come back with, Julie and Rebecca, who've come back with qualitative, does your research or proposed research question at the moment fit into one of those research questions, do you think? So do you think you are asking one of these research questions? Some of you may at the moment be in the position where the research that you're reading is giving you a bit of a mixed approach. Josie, I will email you the link direct later instead of doing it via the Moodle site in answer to your question. So one of you's come back with the answer that you want to do what people think or feel. So that's going to be very much coming from a qualitative perspective. You can't test that. You can't put a randomized control trial into that question. If you're asking somebody how they think or how they feel about something, it's going to be a qualitative perspective. It's going to come from the qualitative paradigm. Some people get confused that they want to do different methodologies, they want to use different methods within their methodology. But if you go back to the session we did first and we talked about ontology and epistemology, if you are coming from one particular perspective, you will come from one particular perspective or the other to ask your question, even if you have a number of different perspectives to add into that question. Your way of thinking doesn't change. The question that you ask doesn't change. So the question that you ask, it's really, really important that you get that question right. So some of the strengths of doing a qualitative piece of research are that it's very in-depth, it's detailed, it's rich, it's descriptions, it's really getting to inside understanding. That the plan of qualitative research is to get that holistic and comprehensive understanding of what you are investigating. So we talk about it as having a holistic perspective, and we look at multi-method mechanisms by which we can do this. And one of the words that you may or may not be familiar with is triangulation. And triangulation is where you come at a question from either a number of methods, a number of sampling strategies, a number of geographical locations. You can have all sorts of methods of triangulation. So, for example, if I wanted to ask a group of student nurses how they felt about their first week in practice, I could do a triangulation of location. So I could ask first-year student nurses in their first week in Bristol, Birmingham and Brighton, the 3 Bs. That would be a triangulation of location. I could ask them via a questionnaire, an interview and a focus group, which would be triangulation of method. I could ask them, so I've done a multi-method approach, or I've done a triangulation of geography. So there's lots of different types of triangulation. One of the other enormous strengths of qualitative research is its flexibility. So as it says there, you can follow the data. It is not about saying at the beginning, I'm going to send out a questionnaire, or I'm going to do a focus group interview. Because if you did either of those methods of data collection and you hadn't adequately covered a specific aspect to the question that you were investigating, it may be necessary to then develop an in-depth interview, a one-to-one interview, so that you can follow the data and really investigate what you are looking at. And the principle behind that is that you are aiming for theoretical saturation. So also we have flexibility in our sample size, because in some studies you may say at your research proposal stage that you wish to interview 10 to 15 subjects. After 15, there may still be new and rich information coming out that requires further investigation, and therefore your sample size may have to then increase. So it's not that rigidity that you might have in a quantitative study where your sample size would be predetermined by a statistical test. Your sample size could shrink or grow depending on your ability to achieve theoretical saturation. And if you read any of the really good material on qualitative research analysis, which Heather is doing a session for you in the latter part of the programme, she will talk about theoretical saturation, I'm sure. And the idea of validity. It's getting valid data, collecting valid data, and this is where, again, the idea of theoretical saturation really comes to play. But there's no new ideas coming out. Researchers talk about doing what they think is going to be their final interview, and their final interview throws up some complete anomaly. And so you then have to really think in depth about whether you need to follow that new piece of information to ensure that all of your other information is as valid as you had assumed. So the strengths are very much about gaining a holistic perspective on your data. Any questions? No? No questions? Well, a question's come through about our science papers a mixture. I'm not sure what you really mean by the term science papers. You could expand on that question a little bit. I'd suggest that those sort of papers will tend to be quantitative in nature. So the discovery of gene papers will be quantitative in nature because there will be a quantitative question that they are testing or revealing. The case reports, on the other hand, could be both qualitative or quantitative in nature. Do I have a narrative review on which? A comprehensive narrative review should include both qualitative and quantitative work, and that's rather dependent on your subject area. So, for example, in your area, I would assume, and this is only an assumption because I'm not particularly well read in your particular subject area, is that there will be a wealth of quantitative research regarding your particular area, and there may not be as much qualitative research. There may not be a wealth of qualitative research in terms of the study that you, the narrative review that you will be, the subject area that you will be following in your narrative review. It doesn't therefore mean that your research for next year can't be qualitative, because in fact what your narrative review is intended to reveal is a gap in the literature. And therefore your concluding statement in your narrative review should be a research question for further, a statement for further research, whether that be a quantitative research question or a qualitative research statement. So hopefully that answers your question. So as it says there, qualitative research is explorative, theory generating and inductive. Its purpose and its aim is to, yes we certainly can, maybe over the phone. Its purpose is always to explore, not to define and answer or measure. And I think that's sometimes where the essence of qualitative research is either clear to you or not. Hopefully it's becoming more clear. So as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, 4 weeks ago now, the kind of research designs we're talking about can be ethnographic, phenomenological, or based on grounded theory. And if we look at ethnographic research, we're seeking to understand human behaviour in the cultural and social context in which it takes place. And so our methods are going to be observation and interview. So if you go back to those particular research question slide, questions asked in qualitative research, ethnographic research is very much based on what is going on in a particular setting. That's really where we are sitting if we're looking at it from an ethnographic perspective. And it's about understanding that sort of human behaviour and understanding the human behaviour in the place that it takes place. So there's no truly ethnographic research has to encompass some aspect of observation, because you are looking at what people are doing and seeking to understand why they do it in the place that they're in. So that those old research studies which were done in the 70s about patients' behaviour, building up to statements in the 90s about the expert patient. And I'm sure you've all read and looked at things about when a patient goes into hospital and they take their clothes off and they put their pyjamas on in the middle of the afternoon, even if there's nothing physically wrong with them at that particular moment. You know, that 35-year-old that's come in for a wisdom teeth removal and is got undressed in the middle of the day. And it's because it's understanding why you behave in that particular way, why you suddenly adopt the role of a patient or the role of a sick person. There's been a lot of research done about student behaviour, for example, in education, and how people react differently in university versus the hospital, and how students, midwives and nurses adopt a student role when they're here in the university and adopt a professional role when they're in the hospital community. And it's ethnographic research is very much about seeking to understand why people do what they do in the environment they're in. And so some of the factors that you will be looking at is, what is that social and cultural context? So ethnographic research is very much based around how you understand human behaviour. Whereas phenomenological research is interested in how respondents give meaning to their experiences and how they perceive the world. And to do truly phenomenological research, it's an in-depth interview, maybe starting from a focus group interview but then building to an in-depth interview is the only way you're going to really understand how somebody gives meaning to their experience. And in phenomenological research, you'll often hear people talking about the storytelling aspect and allowing a respondent to tell their story in their own words. And so sort of an unstructured or semi-structured interview would be wholly appropriate if you were doing this type of research. You would allow your respondent to tell their story. How does it feel? So somebody asked a how do people think and feel question. This is really lending itself to a phenomenological perspective. And if you want to find out how somebody thinks or how somebody feels about a particular issue, then you need to let them tell you. So sometimes questionnaires can be a little conflicting and a little bit restrictive because you are putting questions in their mouth, as it were. And so sometimes it's about giving loose prompts in your interview to allow them to tell their story, and it's a narrative account, and it's these respondents' narratives that are key in a phenomenological research study. So what you end up with in phenomenological research is huge amounts of verbal material that you have to then transcribe and analyse. And I know that Heather's going to talk about data analysis in terms of qualitative research later. But it will be very much about looking for themes, just like you are doing now with your narrative account. So if you interviewed 30, well, you wouldn't necessarily interview 30, but if you interviewed 10 people about how they thought or felt about a particular issue, you would get their stories. And from those stories you will look for specific phrases and specific themes, just like you are now reading through all the literature and looking for specific themes. Certain words and phrases that are common to all the different respondents. So a lot of rich data and a lot of words to review in phenomenological research. Moving on to grounded theory, sort of shares some of the ideas of ethnography and phenomenology because it's looking at the phenomena from the viewpoint of the respondent. But one thing that differs with grounded theory is that you are allowing the data to form the theory. So you go into grounded theory studies without a clear defined theoretical perspective to investigate. And the aim of grounded theory is to end with a theory. So this is where there is no previous research that's been done specifically on this issue. So any of you that are involved in studies or pieces of work that are very groundbreaking, you may be looking at a piece of grounded theory. So the methods of data collection are going to be very much determined by the respondents. So you might start with an exploratory questionnaire or exploratory focus groups to define further research questions to then go on investigate in terms of an interview, an in-depth interview, or a semi-structured interview. So these are sort of methods of data collection. And one of the key components of grounded theory is something called constant comparative analysis. So that as you collect the data, you analyze the data, and therefore your methods of data collection change as you collect data, because you might have to follow a particular avenue of investigation. Have any questions on that? Any questions at all? Have I lost you all? Okay. So, some of the variations that can occur in terms of your research design, you may do a longitudinal study, you might do a cross-sectional study. So longitudinal is what it says, it's over a period of time. So you might be asking people over a snapshot of periods. So if you were investigating how people managed their pain in a particular type of cancer, you might want them every 3 months following their pain clinic review. That might be an example of a longitudinal study. A cross-sectional study is you're looking at it in a snapshot of time. So a cross-sectional study, going back to that earlier example I gave about asking first week students in Brighton, Birmingham, and I can't remember the other one I said. That would be an example of a cross-sectional study. So getting one period of time, getting a cross-section of your sample. Retrospective or prospective, most research is retrospective. You're asking people to recount what's happened. Prospective research is very difficult. How are you going to feel? What are you going to do? Those kind of questions are very difficult to answer. So much research is retrospective. Evaluative, so you are evaluating a particular issue or a particular treatment or a particular intervention. Comparative, so you might be looking at the responses of men versus women, for a gender example, or age groups, or geographical locations, and there may be an aspect of triangulation coming in there. A Delphi technique. Has anybody heard of a Delphi technique? No? Some people are stating that they've heard of it but don't understand it. A Delphi technique is when you've got together a group of perceived experts to ask them a question. So if you were looking at a cancer treatment, for example, you might get a group of cancer specialist nurses together and ask them, and that would be a type of Delphi study, in the fact that you've got what are considered to be experts in the field together to collaborate on their views. And often a Delphi technique is something we might use at the beginning of a grounded theory study to develop a interview schedule to take forward to the wider population. So it's often an aspect or a portion of a research study. And hopefully some of you have heard of action research, which is another variation. Can anybody tell me what it is? Yes, sort of research as it happens. Action research is a cyclical process where you, very much sort of following the ideas of the nursing process in a way, you do something in practice, you evaluate it, you amend it, you reintroduce it, you evaluate it, you reintroduce it, you evaluate it. So it might be an evaluative study of a particular teaching program, for example. So we might have a piece of action research that looks at the effectiveness of hand washing posters or something. I mean, that's a very simplistic example, but where you are putting in something to change practice or change performance, and then collecting data to see how much it's reviewed. So hoping for an improvement or a change. Very much action research is very much linked to change management. So the types of qualitative data that we'll be collecting if we're doing a qualitative study are behaviour and social interactions, experiences and opinions. So if we look at behaviour and social interactions, this is very much looking at it from, if we are collecting data that's involved with behaviour, then we are often going to be using methods of data collection such as observation, whether it be participant or non-participant observation, or we are observing social interactions, so that might be a non-participant observation, or if we are doing a focus group interview, we will be looking at a social interaction, or we might be doing an in-depth interview. Or we're collecting data around experiences. So courses of events and sensations. So typically, if we're looking at collecting data surrounding somebody's experiences of an event or how they felt or what they think, you're going to use an interview. That's going to be the best way of collecting that information. Opinion. If we're trying to collect people's opinions on a particular practice, a particular treatment, a particular event, how they thought or felt about it, then again we could use a questionnaire, we could use an interview, we could use a focus group. So there's different methods of data collection that we could use if we wanted to collect people's opinions. The word opinion often sort of makes people sort of sit up and bristle a little bit, because they think, if I'm asking for your opinion, is that valid research? And yes, of course it is. If I'm asking the opinion of a group of people that I have identified as my sample, then what they think and feel about a particular issue is valid research data. So I think we've mentioned all of these really now. We've talked about an individual interview, we've talked about focus group interview, we've talked about, and we're going to talk about participatory research, and we're going to talk about action research. So what's an individual interview? I think we sort of know what an individual interview is. It's useful when we want to explore a person's experiences perspective from their viewpoint in detail. The relationship and dialogue between the interviewer and the interviewee is important for the type and quality of the data. So the kind of interviews that we'll be looking at are semi-structured interviews, open-ended interviews, in-depth interviews, longitudinal, repeated, formal versus informal. And it's really key to remember, have in the back of your head, if you're thinking about doing an interview for your research study, what is it you're going to be asking? And the sort of key mantra that needs to be there is, what do I want to know? What do I want to find out? What is it I want to discover? And therefore, what is the best way to discover that? So if you want to find out somebody's in-depth account of their experiences of childbirth, the best way to do that would be to sit them down in a non-threatening, informal manner and have a conversation with them. Have an interview schedule that is flexible and open-ended and allow them to tell their story. And if that was the kind of research that you wanted to discover their particular experiences and their particular feelings and thoughts, what research design do you think you would be following that we've mentioned before? So from what research? Absolutely qualitative, definitely qualitative, but more specific. So yes, we could look at it from a grounded theory perspective and allow their theories to develop, but I think that there's possibly an awful lot of theoretical perspectives about the phenomena of giving birth. And so if you were looking at it from a particular perspective, then I think you would be coming from a phenomenological perspective. And to add another word into the mix, we might add hermeneutic phenomenology. Hermeneutics is about looking at particular language and phrases, or interpretive phenomenology, where we are looking to analyse how to interpret that narrative account. So those of you who said phenomenological approach, great, that's absolutely right. Grounded theory could definitely be there as well. But if we're using an in-depth, open-ended, informal interview, then the chances are we are coming at it from a phenomenological perspective, because we're therefore seeking to understand from the individual's perspective their experiences. So I'll try and keep my head still, Rachel. So if we then went on to look at a focus group interview, and the focus group interview can generate data on similar and different views of a group of people who are discussing their experiences with or views on a particular subject. So it's also possible to observe how people's power relationships are displayed in social negotiations in groups. And it's important also to observe the group dynamics. So a focus group interview, hopefully you're all aware of what a focus group interview is. Focus group interview is when you have got a group of people together who have a common theme that you wanted to investigate. So if you wanted to find out what first-year student nurses felt, you would get a group of first-year student nurses together. But one of the things that's very key with a focus group interview is that group dynamic. And I know from all of you will have been in situations, whether it be meetings or classrooms or just in groups of friends, there are certain people who talk and there are certain people who aren't talking. And there are certain people who become engaged and involved, and there are certain people who sit back and observe. Now, the problem you face if you are doing a focus group interview is the person who sits back and observes may have some really important and rich data to bring to the discussion, but because of the group dynamic doesn't feel able or confident to do so. So a skilled interviewer in this situation would hopefully bring out that person into the discussion, and if that wasn't possible, then maybe they would have to do an interview on a one-to-one basis with that person, or maybe a smaller group with the people that weren't offering information. Because as we all know, in any kind of research field, the people who shout the loudest are often the people who have the extremes of views. So we know this from patient satisfaction surveys. What you hear back in patient satisfaction surveys is the extremes, the fantastic and the dreadful, and the massive amount of people in the middle who have okay and nothing to particularly complain or praise, don't respond or aren't the loudest voice. And so often in data collection we have to be aware of the people who are doing the talking. And I'm sure you can all sit there and think of a social setting where certain people have done the talking and certain people haven't. And it's not because they don't have valuable information to bring to the discussion. You are bringing, in a focus group interview, you are hoping that the people that you have brought together can be a cooperative and cohesive group, but that's very difficult to tell in advance. And so that ability to determine whether you are getting all the information you need is really important. A good piece of research won't just have a focus group interview as a method of data collection. There will have been some sort of supplementary data collection method employed to either explore what's come out of a focus group interview or have determined the questions that are asked. Participatory research is when the researcher works together with the research subjects or informants to generate the data, and it's a collective process. This approach can be applied to any specific research methodology, but the principles of knowledge production in this process is in itself qualitative and needs to be documented by the researcher. So, for example, if you wanted to do some participant observation, so you wanted to go and, if you were looking to see how people managed after critical incidents in an ITU, you might go and work in ITU for a period of time. The data that you would collect by just being in the situation and just being in the environment of your research subjects would generate data. So it would have an influence on the questions that you ask and the information that you are privy to. You have certain ethical and practical problems when you do any kind of participatory research, because it's that whole idea of your subjects being on the record or off the record in a way. They might behave in a certain way. They may behave differently because they know they are being observed or being reviewed or being researched. We call that the Hawthorne effect. When you change your behavior because of what's happening. And I'm sure all of you are aware of, if you know you're being watched doing something, you might do it slightly differently. I know from a personal perspective, when I am being observed in the classroom, I'm sure I teach differently than I do when I'm not. And I'm not suggesting that that's a good or a bad thing, it's just different. And when you are doing participatory research, you need to be very much aware of that and aware of the environment in which you are working. So this kind of participatory research, where you are immersed in the situation and are collecting the data about the social context, what research design do you think we're coming from here? Which particular research perspective do you think we're talking about when we are working with research subjects and generating the data while in the situation that we're in? Any ideas? Just a couple of answers. Yes, you could be grounded theory, but you are more typically going to be ethnographic. So there didn't need to be a question mark at the end of that. It's ethnographic research. Because ethnographic research is very much asking questions about what is happening in the social setting and why people are behaving in the way they are. So moving on to action research, we talked a little bit about that being a cycle, and it's using research to shape policy and practice, and the action research cycle is about knowledge gathering, implementing that knowledge. So in the example I gave earlier about doing something, gathering more information, implementing it again. So we might gather information about what people know about hand washing in a particular clinical environment. We might implement that knowledge by putting a teaching program together and maybe doing a poster campaign or something of that nature to improve our knowledge, gathering more knowledge to see gathering more data to see what they then know, to see whether our program has been effective, and then maybe adapting that teaching program to address any of the holes in their knowledge. So it's that cyclical approach. And action research, one of the sort of issues with action research is that it doesn't necessarily have a beginning or an end. And if you are doing it as your dissertation and doing it as a piece of research for your master's, you need to have a very definitive end point. Otherwise you could be going on forever, and that can be quite challenging. Because as we said with qualitative, the data takes you on a journey and it takes you to a particular place. And if we're looking at this piece of action research from a grounded theory perspective, when are we going to get to the end? When are we going to have explored all the phenomena that are emerging? And where is the data going to take us? And so a piece of grounded theory action research could go on forever because there will never be an end point, and that can be very challenging in terms of your dissertation. And I'm not suggesting that it isn't an excellent piece of work to do, but along with your supervisor and your support team that you put in place for next year's research is be very clear about a beginning and an end point. Otherwise your stress levels will be higher than they need to be. I'm speaking from personal experience. No, it doesn't have to only be linked to grounded theory. Action research could be from a phenomenological perspective, but the problem, if it was phenomenological, would be that the knowledge gathering stage would take too long, and would it necessarily get onto the knowledge implementing stage? You could certainly do a piece of ethnographic action research, and actually action research and ethnography sit very nicely together. Just from personal experience, I used it from a grounded theory perspective and sort of found it very difficult to find an end point. My circle didn't end, and I sort of had to put a full stop in where a full stop didn't necessarily exist. There were many questions left open, but one of the strengths of a piece of research often is the questions that you end up with. So some of the key issues to think about when we're talking about a qualitative piece of research is the purpose, the motivation. Research can't be done for research's sake, so there needs to be a very clear purpose to your research and a clear motivating factor. The issue then is there theoretical or personal or political bias? So are you being asked to do this by your manager? Is there a national policy driver that's influencing and motivating you to particularly collect a certain piece of information? Or is this something that really bugs you and therefore really you are feeling really passionate about? And those sort of biases, they are fine, they are incredibly acceptable, and they exist in the real world. But what you need to be able to do is sort of hold on to them and maybe simply be aware of them so that you can ensure that when you are analysing and collecting your data and then analysing your data, you don't force your preconceived biases on that information. And everybody has bias, everybody has personal and professional and theoretical knowledge and that underpins what they do, so you can't put it away, but you just need to be aware of it. Access to your data, so access to your sample, is often complex, and it's the researcher's role in that is, again, something that needs to be thought through very carefully. Who are you collecting your data from, and how can you get at these people? And will your collecting data from this group of people have any kind of ethical or personal or professional issues surrounding it? The role of the social role of the researcher is also really important to think about. Is if you were going to do a Delphi study, for example, on midwives who were supervisor midwives and the key issues, will your membership, if you are a supervisor of midwives, would your membership to that group of people influence the data that you collected and the information that they gave you? So will your knowledge and their knowledge of you influence the information you give them? So this idea of that objectivity and subjectivity and reflexivity. For example, when I was doing my first master's, I collected data about newly qualified staff nurses on a surgical unit, and I was the unit manager. So did they give me information that they thought I wanted to hear, or were they giving me a true piece of information? And if they gave me information that was possibly problematic, i.e. they'd done something wrong, in inverted commas, what was I going to be able to do about it, and what was going to be my role in addressing any issues that came out of the research? And the ethics committee were very clear with me about I couldn't interview my junior staff nurses in uniform, I couldn't interview them in my office, I had to interview them in a non-threatening place, I had to do it in my own clothes. And yes, I had to very much discuss it in my dissertation. I had to really fess up, for want of a better expression, to who I was and what I did. And when one particular staff nurse told me something that was really quite worrying, I then had to ask this particular staff nurse if he would repeat the story to me in my office in uniform. And his answer was, no, I won't. So I then had to go through a very difficult situation of discussing it with my supervisor and my other managers as to what I was going to do. And it wasn't resolved in a particularly helpful way, but those are the issues that are there when you are a researcher of people that you either have a management role with or a care role with. But what happens if things don't go to plan, and if you get told things that are potentially worrying? Some of the issues around sampling can be quite difficult as well, because often you are picking people, you do purposive sampling, i.e. you are picking these people on purpose, but you are hoping to get maximum variation in who you are talking to. So if I wanted to talk to first year student nurses in their first week of practice, for example, I would want to talk to a large age range, so not just 18-year-olds who've just come out of school, the whole age range, so get a nice broad perspective on all ages of the groups. I'm just answering a question that Rebecca's typed in about pitfalls of using colleagues. Yes, there are many pitfalls, but you can also there are many advantages. So as long as you are very clear about what you're asking and why, and you are very clear about the perspective from which you are going to come from, then there shouldn't be a reason not to ask them. But equally, if you looked at it from a personal perspective, would it be better to talk to a group in a different trust that you weren't too close to? And maybe you use your colleagues as your pilot, so you test your method of data collection with them, and then you take it wider. So there are lots of ways sort of through when you negotiate through that sort of data collection issues, and we'll talk about that much more when we talk about in the next module when we talk about our project planning. But yeah, there will be advantages and disadvantages, because will your colleagues be truly honest with you? Will they be as honest as you need them to be? So there are lots of advantages, but there are also some pitfalls. So one of the other things that we've talked about already really is that sort of multi-method approach, that sort of triangulation of approach. So collecting data from a questionnaire, a focus group interview and an in-depth interview. So that would be triangulation of approach. And by triangulating the approach, you are getting a much more holistic view of the issue. So using my earlier example, how do you feel in the first week going into practice? If I gave them a questionnaire, I did a focus group interview, and I interviewed them, I would get all the information I needed to answer my research question or investigate my research statement. And one of the key things about qualitative research, as it differs from quantitative research, is everything is data. Everything you do and every social interaction and every intervention and every episode is as rich a data as that specific questionnaire. So the long conversation is just as important as the particular specific semi-structured interview, because you may get just as much rich data from a conversation with somebody as you would from an interview. There's an ethical boundary and there is a practical boundary there that you must be very, very aware of if you're doing a piece of research, but it doesn't mean that any interaction can't be a valuable piece of information. So there's the idea of detachment from the field. So this very much addresses some of the pitfalls of using colleagues. As a researcher, are you their friend or are you their advocate? And there's all sorts of ethical boundaries and ethical blurrings that we need to be very, very aware of. And Ruth is going to do her session on research ethics, principles of research ethics, but we'll talk about this much more when we actually come into planning our projects, in the fact that as a researcher, the data that you are collecting from somebody is for research purposes. So if you have a conversation with them, you need to tell them that you are a researcher. So even if it's a conversation with a colleague, you might remind them at the beginning, remember, I'm doing this piece of research, so can I take some notes on this conversation? And that would ethically make it possible for you to collect that information. Data analysis can be incredibly time-consuming then, because you might have endless transcriptions of conversations and interviews. There's software that can help you, and there's voice-activated software and NVivo, which is a particular research package that we use in qualitative research. All of these can assist you, but actually immersing yourself in the data and rereading all your material, there's no quick way to do that. So, which is why we don't talk about 50 and hundreds of interviews, we talk about 10s and 20s. So the role of the theory is incredibly important. You've got that analytical generalizations, so you are looking for theoretical saturation and data saturation, that you're not getting anything new. You do another interview in your grounded theory study and the subjects don't say anything that you haven't already heard. They might use different language to explore it or explain it, but it isn't different. And unless you've analysed some of it already, you won't know, which is why we talk about constant comparative analysis. Any questions? No questions? Pause for a minute and see if you've got any questions. Okay, so no questions, so I'm going to carry on. So when we're thinking of doing a qualitative, and some of you have already said that you've got a qualitative question or a qualitative idea, you've got the data that or the research that you're reading is leaning you towards a qualitative question. So why are you interested in this particular question? What is it about this particular issue that sparks your interest? And have you got a theoretical, practice-related, political, or a personal motivation? And it's very important to think about that. Now, lots of you will have particular theoretical ideas, and you will have a practice-related question or a personal-related question that sparks your interest. And one tip would be that if you, as I said to you 4 weeks ago, we don't want to do this assignments for assignment's sake. So this piece of work is very much the beginning of your dissertation, and so to pick something that you're not that interested in now would be a mistake, because if you're not that interested in it now and it doesn't really spark your interest, in a year's time it's going to really be painful, and in 18 months' time, when you are trying desperately to write it up, and submit your dissertation, then it will become really quite difficult. So find something that really sparks your interest, find something that you are really interested in. Hopefully you've found a topic already that you are reading around and collecting your articles for your narrative review so that you can build your dissertation from now. Your particular interest in the study, your bias, is likely to direct the way that you approach the field, the questions that you ask, the analytical strategy that you take. However, in qualitative explorative research, it is likely to be challenged. Therefore, keep that evidence trail. So it's worthwhile, even now, keeping a research diary, because it may be the conversation you have next week with a colleague or the conversation that you have next week with a patient that actually prompts your research question. And that kind of research diary can be a very useful tool in your data that really gives you a holistic perspective. So it might be that conversation that starts your research journey, and keeping that evidence together, keeping that data separate and well recorded is a really important key to a good dissertation. So you've read the literature, you've asked the right question, you've decided what you want to find out. The next thing to think about in a qualitative research study is you've asked what you want to find out, so who are you going to ask? So you've got to find the people to ask, you've got to find your sample. And who are the people that you're going to be asking this question to? Who are you going to be testing? Who are you going to be investigating? And what is your role in terms of that group of people? So going back to an earlier question about pitfalls of asking colleagues, if the question you're asking needs to be answered by your peers, then you need to be very clear about who you are in that relationship. So what's your role? Are you an insider or are you an outsider? Are you a peripheral member to this group? Are you an active member? Are you a complete member? So if I was doing a piece of research on third-year student nurses, would it be appropriate to use the third years here at Plymouth? Or should I go and use the third years in another university? Because my influence on them might be considered to be unethical if I was asking them questions. Who are the gatekeepers? How am I going to get to these people? If I want to ask a group of patients about how they feel about a particular intervention, how am I going to get to these people? How am I going to access them? And can you get access to the data you need to investigate your research question? So if you wanted to ask questions about a particularly difficult and emotive issue, such as sudden infant death, who would you ask? How would you ask them? And how would you get access to them? And that's a really difficult and important thing to think about. Because it may not be appropriate to hang around A&E, as it obviously wouldn't, and wait for people to come in. So how are you going to ask these people, and who are you going to ask? Has anybody got a particular example they'd like to share? No? Okay, I'll go on to sampling. Sampling is about who are you going to include in your study? Who are you going to ask? And one of the methods of sampling that we use in sorry, I've lost my train of thought there. One of the methods of sampling that we use in qualitative research is purposive sampling or purposeful sampling. And this is about choosing people to include a variation of perspectives within a category relevant to your study. So you are picking people on purpose. You are picking people because they are that age or that gender or that occupational group. So this means that overrepresentation of some groups and exclusions of other groups, which is therefore different from representative sampling. So it's not anywhere close to the kind of sampling strategies that we might use in quantitative research. Purposive sampling is a completely different method of sampling. So you are picking these people so you're picking these people because you're picking them on purpose. If you are sampling anybody and you are collecting data from anybody, if you are asking them anything, then you have to go through some sort of ethical committee. And that's sometimes, you know, that will bring its own problems and bring its own complexities. You can no longer in this country do, or anywhere in Europe, do research without ethical permission. Now, we circumvent the rules of research governance sometimes if we do an audit, but we'll go into the finer points of that maybe some other time. But yes, in essence, Rachel, if you are sampling any group of patients or staff, you have to go to an ethics committee. So another type of, so you're picking people on purpose. So I want to know how people, how a certain group of people, I will pick people because of their age, because of what they know. So we might have theoretical sampling as well, in the fact that we might pick a group of midwives because they are supervisors of midwives, so they have got a theoretical component to their knowledge that we are picking on purpose. So again, purposive sampling, but using theory. We might use purposive or convenient sampling. So convenient sampling is the group of people that we have there then. So an example of convenient sampling might be if you're collecting information from a group of people that attend a clinic, those people that are at that clinic at that time are your convenient sample. There's never any issue with using these different sampling strategies. You've just got to be clear about the information that you've collected. And in qualitative research, is that information going to be representative of the general population? So if I collected a group of information from a group of people who were at a specific clinic, would I be able to transfer that information to another group at another clinic? Maybe some of the issues, but not all of the issues. So we look at issues surrounding generalizability and transferability. Because what if I was going back to my earlier research example of collecting how first-year student nurses feel in their first week of practice, if I collect that information from all the first years at Plymouth and I interviewed a selection of first-year student nurses that I selected from a convenient sample of those that attended a tutorial, could I transfer that information to all first years everywhere? No, I couldn't. But what I could say that there were common themes. So the ideas surrounding anxiety and non-familiarity of role and nervousness and fear of the unknown, those issues I could transfer to any group of first-year student nurses in their first week of practice. There may be specific issues that came out of that specific group of students in Plymouth that would not be transferable. to a group in Ipswich, for example. So you've got to think about how much is your group representative of the whole population undergoing a particular intervention or experience. So one of the other things that we talk about is our choice of methods. How can I get, so going back to my fundamental questions is what do I want to know, who am I going to ask, and how am I going to find it out? So how am I going to get the data I need to address the research question that I've asked? So if my research question is how does it feel to be a first-year student nurse in practice, what is the best way I can find that out? Well, the best way might have been to send them all a questionnaire. I might have sent them a quantitative survey scoring things. Typical example of a quantitative survey is that kind of survey where you get satisfied, very satisfied, satisfied, neither here nor there, unsatisfied, very unsatisfied, satisfied. That kind of visual analog quantitative questionnaire. So I might have sent them that questionnaire, and then I might have invited a group of them back for a focus group interview. So I might employ a number of methods of data collection that may be qualitative and quantitative in nature, but the question that I am asking in essence is a qualitative question. So even though I might have done a quite quantitative survey, my research question is still qualitative. And this is where people get a little bit muddled sometimes when they look at a particular piece of research and they say, but there's numbers and there's statistics, there's percentages in it, so it can't be qualitative. Yes, it can. Absolutely it can. Because we go back to that ontology and epistemology idea. Where am I coming from and what am I asking? And if where I'm coming from and what I'm asking is qualitative in nature, then the study is qualitative. Even though I've employed some other methods of data collection to actually answer the question that I've asked. And yes, it is, sometimes it can be a little bit muddling and can be a little bit confusing because you pick up a piece of research and you say, oh, well, it's this or it's that, and it's not clear. But if you go back to the research question, what did they want to find out? And if what they wanted to find out is a qualitative question, then the research is qualitative. And this is what we talk about when we talk about a mixed method or a multi-method approach, and we might triangulate our methods, i.e. do a survey and an interview. It doesn't change the essence of the question. It doesn't change the perspective of the study. It doesn't change the paradigm being qualitative. It simply means that you have employed the best methods of data collection to answer the question that you've asked. Yes, in answer to your question, Rebecca, it very much does. If you are asking a question that's seeking to explore or understand, then the tendency will be that it is a qualitative study. I will just say a but, because of course there's always a but, isn't there? And one of those buts is, if you're reading a piece of research and it's sought to explore the experiences of first-year student nurses, for example, and they just did a survey, your critique of that article will be their research question and their method of data collection didn't match. And you will find that out there. You will find studies that have been published in reputable peer-reviewed journals where you have a research question that is qualitative in nature and they have attempted to answer it using a quantitative method. So if I sought to explore and understand something and then I did a randomized control trial, I would be going about, I wouldn't have answered the question. And that's where you can critique and criticize, in a way, some of the research that you're reading, and you might say, The research aim or the research statement clearly stated that it was seeking to explore and understand, but it went on to conduct a survey, a visual analogue survey, and didn't answer the question appropriately. So it's really important that you try and match up the data collection methods with the overarching ontology and epistemology of the studies that you're reading. Any questions? No? Okay. We've talked a little bit about this already, really, with ethics. And Ruth Endicott's going to talk in much more length about ethics when she comes to do her session on ethics in 4 weeks' time. You sort of shudder when you think about ethics committees, because one of the issues and challenges that you will be facing in 6 to 9 months' time is going to be getting ethical clearance to do your studies, and that means going through an ethics committee or research local research ethics committee. And one of the key principles that you've got to think about is considering the rights and the needs of the people that are involved in the study. So you can't do something to somebody or ask them something and then not support them afterwards. You can't do research for research's sake. So are there some benefits from this study? Can you clearly state to the Research Ethics Committee that this study will benefit the group in a certain way? And if there is ever the possibility of harming anybody, that needs to be addressed. And you might think, oh, well, of course I'm not going to harm them. But if you seek to investigate from a phenomenological perspective how somebody felt when they underwent a traumatic birth, and then by the simple process of interviewing them, you open a wound or a issue that is not resolved, then you need to have a strategy in place to support your group, your subjects. And so it might be that there is a support network available if they need it, and so on. So this is the kind of thing that the Research Ethics Committee might ask you to do. And if you are going to ask patients anything, do anything to any client, then you're going to have to go through very specific requirements. And so think very carefully about who you're going to have to ask in your dissertation, what you're going to ask them and how you're going to ask them, because you've got to have all of these strategies very clearly set out when you do your research proposal. But we'll cover that in much more detail on next module. Any questions? Any questions at all? So to conclude, when we're talking about qualitative research, we're talking about very specific, very defined area. And the questions that we're asking in qualitative research are seeking to investigate what is going on in the particular setting, and what people think and feel about a particular issue, and questions such as that. It's seeking to understand, seeking to explore, not seeking to test, measure or define. Any questions? No? I'll leave the great, that's fantastic. I am going to stop now, and we are going to have just a time check. At 2:30 it is now. We're going to have a 10-minute break, and then we're going to come back and do the assignment guidelines, go through the assignment guidelines that I've put on Moodle. And so if you've got any specific questions surrounding your particular literature review, your narrative literature review, any questions surrounding Heather's session last time, any questions that you've got about the assignment in detail, then either message them or you can email them to me. So we're going to have a 10-minute break, and then we'll be back. Okay. Thank you.